Hey, I'm Dylan, and in this video I'm going to be building a pair of fancy bar stools. Now I'm just going to get stuck straight into this one, no mucking around, and like most of my builds, this one starts out with a template. This one's a commission job, and the client wanted a pair of bar stools that are similar to this dining chair I make. And luckily I'd already made a prototype bar stool in a similar style before, which was perfect for getting the dimensions from, but I think the actual shape and style needed a bit of work. So after a few sketches, I could transfer the dimensions and the new improved shape onto this MDF, and I could get onto cutting out a template. I've spoken about this before, but when it comes to 3D modelling something, if the shape gets too complicated, I tend to get frustrated with how long it takes me to get looking right, and I just prefer to make rough sketches and actually start building the piece. This often means I end up building a few prototypes of each piece to get the shape that I like, which obviously takes way longer than if I was to just sit in front of a computer for an hour or two and just design it right in the first place. But part of me is actually okay with building a bunch of prototypes, as it does help me hone the build method and what style of joinery I'll be using and what part of the build is more complicated and where I might trip up. And being able to 3D model a piece properly wouldn't necessarily help with that, but it definitely would help me arrive at a look I'm after a bit quicker and just stop my house from being full of as much odd furniture. So far I've just been cutting out the template, but having made a version of this before, I knew I needed to leave this little bit at the end of the template, which I'll get to later. But I'm not quite clever enough to be able to predict these things all that far in advance, so having built a prototype, it was handy to know quite a way down the track that this will be a problem if I didn't include it. I'm building these stools out of Tasmanian Blackwood, which to us Australians is one of the most highly regarded furniture timbers grown in Australia. It's not cheap, but it's really beautiful to work with, and it's got really incredible colours once you've oiled it. Once I've got everything roughed out, it's off to the jointer and the thicknesser to get everything flat and square. And once I've done that, I can cut everything down to length and get on with the actual fun part of cutting out the shapes. A thinner blade here would have been probably more ideal, but I do whatever I can to avoid changing my bandsaw blade. It's a bit of a pain, so if I can just nibble my way around these corners, I'm going to do that. After cutting out the back legs, I can get on with the front legs, and it's a very similar process here. And I really love using templates for doing things like this. It just takes all of the guesswork and measurements out of it. Once the roughing out's done, I can get these templates fixed to the legs with some double-sided tape, and then I'll take them across to the router table and get them down to their final shape. This part of the cut can be a little bit sketchy as it's cutting against the grain, but if it's a fine enough pass and you keep a good amount of pressure on the workpiece, it usually turns out okay. Once my leg pieces have all been cut out, I can use some of the offcuts to make some rails. And instead of template routing these, it's easy enough to just sand down to the line. For the joinery, I'm going to be using 10mm dominoes. This domino technique is a little bit questionable, but it does work. I need to make a small parts jig for the domino, but that's a job for another day. Now that I've got the leg assembly out of the way, I can get on with making the seat tops. I'm marking my pieces with an I and an O for in and out. You may have seen this before, but it really helps get the perfect glue up. I joint the I side on the inside and the O side on the outside, and it just means that any slight imperfections with my jointer fence is cancelled out and everything just comes out perfectly flat. This can also be done on the table saw as well. I just prefer the results that I get off the jointer. Whilst the seat tops are gluing up, I can turn my attention to the seat backs. And for these, I'm going to be making steam bent backs, and I'm using this piece of scrap LVL to make the inside mould for the backs. So this is a little bit difficult to explain, but to make the outer portion of the mould that will press on this part, I need to make another jig to cut it with a slightly larger diameter. It took me a little while to realise that I can't just use the offcut of the inside part of the mould, as once you've actually got the seat back in there with its thickness, the inside radius is smaller than the outside. This might be obvious to some people, but I'm a bit of a dum-dum, so it wasn't to me. So what I'm doing here is adding a 9mm thick strip of plywood to this jig, which in combination with my 12mm router bit is equal to the thickness of my seat back, which gives this part a slightly bigger radius to the inside part. And I'll be using the outside portion of this cut as my mould blank, so I need to be really careful to not let the router bit slip off this temporary jig that I've drilled to the LVL. Off camera, I flashed up this other part that I'm gluing on with my template router. Onto the actual seat backs, I'm cutting strips at the bandsaw, and I've put this marker at the end of the piece so that I can easily remember which order it goes back together when I glue it back together. And in between cuts, I'm taking really shallow passes on the jointer just to clean up that surface so that when I glue it back together, it comes together as neatly as possible. And then I can take really fine passes at the thicknesser just to get it to its final thickness. I did a few experiments, and with strips this thick, without steaming, I was getting cracking. And I didn't want to cut it into thinner strips, as the more cuts I made, the more material I'd lose and the more the end grain would look chopped up. And I also didn't want to steam just one 20mm thick back, as I just didn't trust how much it would spring back. These strips got steamed for about half an hour maybe. And then once they were cool to the touch, which took maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I took them out and then just let them dry in a clamp overnight. This is jumping back in time a little bit, but while I was making the mould, I took some time to build a jig to route notches in the legs for the seat backs to sit in. I initially cut this shape out at the bandsaw, but quickly realised that I wasn't going to get quite an accurate enough cut off that, so I knocked up this quick and dirty table saw sled to just help me cut it more accurately. This piece of MDF I've got in between these two slopey pieces of wood represents the thickness of the seat backs. The piece that I just screwed into the top is there to hold things in the right position, temporarily. And this piece that I'm screwing in now is acting as a fence. And this little bit of pliers just to make sure nothing twists. And I can remove this piece now, as it's going to get in the way of the router in a second. Transferring this measurement doesn't need to be super accurate. I just need to make sure that once I've cut the notch in this leg, the following notches on the other legs follow this first leg. And this is where that extra bit at the end of the template is important, as it allows a bit of that left-hand side of the jig to have a spot to rest on. And that bit of blue painter's tape that I put on earlier just stops any blowouts from happening. Once I'd finished cutting the notches in the rest of the legs, I could get on with finishing up the seat tops. I'm cutting these mortises on the widest setting, and I cut the mortises on the tight setting for the seat top, which allows for a bit of expansion and contraction. And I feel like the purists might argue that this is bad form, but I've had my original dining chair for about a year now, and that's been through summer and winter, and it's held up just fine without any signs of weakening. And I've got other chairs that are even older than this that I've made with similar floating tenon style joinery, and they're also just fine, so I'm pretty confident that this will be strong enough and won't fall apart from seasonal movement. Here I'm cutting out a cross rail, which is for your feet to sit on. I don't know what it's actually called. Back to the seat legs, and now that I've cut those notches, I can get rid of that bit of sacrificial timber at the top of the leg. This arc here is an aesthetic touch just to match the curviness of the legs. Once that was done, I could take all my parts to the router table and give everything a round over. If I'd had my time again, I probably would have pre-finished all these parts. Using blue painter's tape sort of works, but I still ended up getting some glue squeeze out which needed sanding, which all just adds up to unnecessary extra time and effort. At this point, I was starting to rush a little bit. I made these chairs just before Christmas and I wanted to finish them off. And this was also my last project in this workshop as we were moving houses over Christmas and I had to pack everything up and shift it. As a result, I was a little bit hasty with filming this part and I didn't realise that my memory card was nearly full. Anyway, it was just a glue up. We've all seen one of those before. The last remaining part of this build was attaching the seat backs to the legs, and to do that I'm using dowels. These handy little inserts have a spike on the end of them, so when you put a piece up to it that you want to attach with a dowel, a gentle squeeze transfers a mark across, which just helps you accurately drill the dowel holes in the mating piece. After a final bit of finish sanding, I can apply some hard wax oil, and it's always really exciting at this point, just watching the wood come to life. And with that, these pieces were done.